I still remember that Tuesday morning as if it were burned into my skin, the kind of day you don't just live through, you carry it with you. I was 64, and after burying James 3 months earlier, I thought the hardest storms of my life had already passed. But grief is strange. It doesn't end. It just shifts shape. That morning began like any other, with the Texas sun creeping through the blinds and the sound of my neighbor's dog barking at the mail truck. I had just poured myself a cup of coffee when the phone rang, sharp and precise at 9 a.m. on the dot. A woman's voice, clipped and professional, told me the attorneys at Holloway Legal Group were ready to finalize James's estate. 2 o'clock. Be there with the documents. She might as well have been asking me to pick up dry cleaning. No warmth, no condolences, just business. I hung up and sat there with the coffee cooling in my hands, trying to steady the sudden thrum in my chest. I decided to wear the navy dress James had once called my lucky color. He'd given it to me for our 35th anniversary, just 2 years before cancer came and rearranged my world. I clasped the pearls he had slid around my neck on our wedding day, stared at myself in the mirror, and barely recognized the woman gazing back. The auburn streaks in my hair had surrendered to gray, and grief had etched lines across my face like someone had taken a chisel to stone. I muttered to myself, "Pull it together, Helen." I wanted to believe I could close this chapter with dignity, but as I drove toward downtown Austin, I felt that gnawing unease. Traffic crawled along I-35, horns bleating, the smell of gasoline thick in the air, my fingers tapping the steering wheel to some nervous rhythm only I could hear. James and I had gone over his will 100 times at the kitchen table, cups of sweet tea between us, his hand covering mine. Everything was clear. I would inherit, and after I passed, Christopher and his family would be provided for. It was simple, honorable, just like him. Still, as I pulled into the cold concrete garage beneath the law office, a tremor worked its way up my arm. I sat for a moment, gripping the wheel, telling myself it was just nerves, that I was imagining shadows where there were none. I gathered my purse, the folder with James's meticulous notes, and tried to straighten my shoulders the way my friend Marjorie used to tell me back when we were girls in choir. Head high, Helen. Don't let them see you shake. And then it happened. A voice ricocheted off the concrete. "Ma'am, wait, don't start that car." My blood turned to ice. From behind one of the pillars stepped a man, probably in his 50s, clothes ragged, hair a wild mess as if it had battled too many nights in the open air. His jacket hung off him like it belonged to someone bigger. His boots were scuffed down to nothing. My first thought was danger. James had always warned me about lonely parking garages. My hand went instinctively toward my phone, but then I caught his eyes. Not wild, not threatening. There was something else. Desperation, yes, but also concern. And for reasons I still can't explain, I froze, waiting to hear what this stranger had to say. He wasn't raving or drunk, the way I half expected a man in his condition to be. His eyes were steady, not wild, and there was something in them I couldn't quite place at first. Not menace, but a kind of urgent compassion, like someone trying to stop a train before it derailed. He stayed a careful distance back, hands half raised as if to show me he meant no harm. "Please, ma'am, just a minute. I need to tell you something important." My stomach dropped. I tightened my grip on the purse strap slung across my shoulder, fingers brushing the cool edge of my phone inside, my heart pounding so loud it seemed to echo against the concrete walls. "You're Mrs. Foster, right? James's widow?" he asked. The sound of my husband's name on a stranger's lips nearly buckled my knees. I felt my breath catch. Who was this man? How did he know about James, about me? The instinct to run nearly overtook me, but my body betrayed me. I froze, like a deer when headlights blind its path. I tried to sound firm, though my voice wavered. "I don't know who you are, but you need to step back and leave me alone." I fumbled toward my phone, praying my shaking fingers wouldn't drop it. He shook his head quickly, almost pleading. "Ma'am, please." "I know it looks bad. My name's Frank Doyle. I used to work upstairs at Holloway Legal Group, 12 years as a paralegal until they tossed me out 3 weeks ago. But before they let me go, I overheard things. Things I couldn't just keep to myself. His words tumbled out, heavy with urgency, bouncing off the garage walls. For a second, the low hum of fluorescent lights above seemed louder than my own breathing. Then he said it. It's about your husband's will. My body went rigid. The name of the firm, the one I was minutes away from walking into, hung in the air like a curse. Holloway Legal Group had handled everything for James for decades. Our estate planning, property contracts, even the refinancing on our house back in Westlake Hills. My throat tightened as Frank's eyes darted around, scanning the shadows as if someone might be listening. "It's your daughter-in-law, Amber," he whispered. "She's been meeting with them, paying them. There are documents, false ones. She's been preparing something to make it look like James changed his will before he passed." I felt the blood drain from my face, my palms slick with sweat, the folder under my arm slipping against the smooth leather of my purse. "What do you mean?" My voice cracked like it belonged to someone else. Frank's face twisted, part shame, part urgency. "She's been telling people you're not well, that you're confused, that you forget things. I've seen the papers. Medical records, statements, even so-called witnesses swearing you've been slipping. They're building a case to make you look unfit to manage the estate." His words hit me like a body blow, hard and merciless, leaving me doubled over inside my own chest. For a moment, the garage tilted, and I had to grip the cool concrete pillar beside me just to stay upright. My hand shot out and gripped the side of my car so hard I thought the metal might dent under my fingers. "That's impossible," I whispered, more to myself than to him. My voice sounded foreign, thin and cracked. "I've never been diagnosed with anything. I'm perfectly fine." He didn't argue, just gave me a slow nod, his expression almost tender. "I know," he said softly. "That's exactly why I've been waiting down here, praying I'd catch you before they got to you." "She wasn't counting on you showing up, Mrs. Foster," Amber told Mister. "Holloway, you'd probably forget the appointment altogether." That sentence cracked something in me. Fear was still there, tightening my chest, but anger roared through it like fire. How dare she? How dare anyone question my mind, my memory, my very sanity? I'd survived losing my husband, raising a son, decades of bills and late nights and holding a family together. And this girl, this woman I had welcomed into my home, thought she could erase all that with a forged piece of paper? My nails bit into the strap of my purse as I steadied myself, rage burning hotter than grief ever had. Frank's eyes softened, but his voice grew heavier. "There's more, ma'am." She hasn't just whispered doubts. She's been manufacturing them. Forged documents, medical reports that never existed. Papers that claimed James himself was worried you couldn't handle the money, that he wanted to change the will in those last weeks. The words wrapped around me like chains, pulling me under. For a heartbeat, I couldn't breathe. I remembered those nights in the hospital, James holding my hand, his voice weak but steady, asking me to make sure the lights were always on in the house, to keep the garden blooming in spring, to carry on with the life we built. Never once did he question me. Never once did he suggest I wasn't capable. If anything, he'd trusted me more than himself when it came to managing our finances. I had always been the one with the spreadsheets, the one balancing the checkbook at the kitchen table, while he teased me about being the boss. "Why?" I finally managed to ask, my eyes searching his weathered face for any twitch of deceit. "Why are you telling me this?" He lowered his gaze, shifted his weight in those worn-out boots, and then looked back up at me with a steadiness that made me ache. "Because I liked your husband, Mrs. Foster." James treated me like a human being when others didn't. He'd ask about my daughter's college plans, bring coffee when he stopped by the office. He was a good man, and what they're doing to his memory and to you, it isn't right. His voice caught on that last word, as if he still carried the weight of his own failures, his own regrets, but was determined not to add mine to the pile. He straightened his back as if the weight of his threadbare jacket suddenly embarrassed him, and said quietly, "I may not have much, but I still have my conscience." That word, conscience, echoed inside me louder than the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I looked at him, this man with nothing but the shadows to shelter him, and realized he was risking the scraps of dignity he had left just to warn me. "What's your name?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. He lifted his chin. "Frank Doyle, ma'am. I was a paralegal at Holloway Legal Group for 12 years before they decided I knew too much about their side business." The phrase made my stomach knot. "Side business?" I whispered. Frank's eyes darted around, and for a heartbeat, I thought someone might step out of the darkness to silence him. "They've been doing more than drafting wills," he said. "They've been adjusting them for the right price, making family members vanish from inheritance documents, rewriting history for a fee. Your daughter-in-law, Amber, she's been paying them well." "Very well." At that moment, the elevator dinged in the distance, a sharp metallic sound that sent a chill through me. Frank's shoulders stiffened, and he stepped back into the shadows as if the very walls might swallow him. "Ma'am, you need to be careful in there. They'll try to slide papers in front of you, push you to sign without looking. Don't let them. Whatever happens, don't let them rush you." Before I could find another word, he slipped away, his figure dissolving between the rows of cars like smoke. I stood rooted to the concrete, the echo of his warning circling me. My breath came fast, my palms slick against the leather of my purse. Every instinct screamed at me to dismiss his story as the rambling of a bitter man who'd lost his job. And yet, somewhere deeper, a place beyond logic, I knew he was telling the truth. It was in his eyes, weary but honest, and in the way he'd said James's name like it meant something sacred. Amber's face flashed in my mind then. 8 years she'd been my daughter-in-law, always with that practiced sweetness, that too bright smile. But hadn't I noticed things? The hushed conversations with Christopher that stopped when I walked into a room, the way her hand lingered on his arm as if to keep him on her side, the little flicker of annoyance in her eyes when I spoke about James or our marriage. I had brushed it off, telling myself I was oversensitive, that she was young and trying to find her place in the family. Now, standing in that cold parking garage with my heart pounding and my faith unraveling, I wondered if those little moments had been the mask slipping, if she had been quietly rewriting my story all along. Amber had always been careful in public, but I couldn't unsee those small betrayals. The way she redirected every family conversation away from me, as if my stories about James were inconveniences rather than memories. The way her lips tightened when I mentioned our 40 years together, like she was irritated by a history she couldn't control. Those images churned inside me as my finger trembled on the elevator button. The doors slid shut with a heavy sigh, and for an instant I caught Frank's face in the narrowing crack, his worried eyes fixed on me as if to say, "Don't let them win." The ride upward felt endless, every floor number glowing in slow succession, while my pulse kept racing ahead. By the time the doors opened on the 15th floor, I was lightheaded. The reception area was just as polished as I remembered. Mahogany desks gleaming under perfect lighting, the smell of lemon polish heavy in the air. Years ago, James and I had admired this office, even joked that it felt more like a museum than a law firm. But now the expensive artwork on the walls, the marble floors beneath my heels, all of it seemed like part of a trap, a stage built to lull people into signing their lives away. The receptionist greeted me with a smile that had no warmth behind it, the kind of smile a waitress might give a customer she despised but still needed to tip well. "Mrs. Foster, they're waiting for you in conference room." My heels clicked too loudly as I walked down the long corridor. The silence unnerved me. Most doors were shut, but I could hear muffled voices behind them, hushed and deliberate, like conspirators hiding in plain sight. I stopped in front of a frosted glass door, my hand resting on its brass handle, the cool metal biting into my palm. Through the blurry glass shapes moved. I saw the outlines of 3 men in suits, their posture sharp, their presence heavy, and then, unmistakable, a 4th silhouette. Small frame, perfectly styled hair that Amber always fussed over in family photos. My chest tightened. She was here. For a moment, I wanted to turn and run back to the elevator, but something rooted me in place. I drew a breath that scraped down my throat, pushed the door open, and stepped into the room. It was as intimidating as Frank had promised. 3 men in tailored suits lined one side of the long table, Amber on the other. She looked up at me, and in that split second, something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe fear. But she recovered too quickly, her practiced sweetness snapping into place so seamlessly that for a moment, I almost questioned if I had imagined it. Amber's smile was the kind she'd perfected over 8 years of family dinners and holiday photographs, sweet on the surface but hollow underneath. "Oh, Helen," she said lightly, "I didn't think you'd be coming today." The way she phrased it, too casual, too rehearsed, made Frank's warning echo in my ears. She hadn't expected me to show up, and the fact that I had threw a crack into her performance. I forced my voice to stay calm, though every nerve in me was sparking. Of course I'm here. This is about my husband's estate. Nothing could keep me away. My words felt like stones dropped into a pond, heavy and deliberate. Across the table, the lead attorney, tall, thin, with silver hair slicked back too carefully and eyes like winter steel, gestured to the empty chair at the head of the table. "Mrs. Foster," he said smoothly, "please have a seat. We just need a few signatures." I lowered myself into the chair, my purse set firmly on the polished wood as if staking a claim. Amber's hand caught my eye. She was twisting her wedding ring round and round, a nervous tic she probably didn't even realize she had. She wouldn't meet my gaze, her eyes fixed on the papers spread before her like they might shield her from me. My voice, steadier now, cut through the silence. "Before I sign anything, I want to be perfectly clear on what we're discussing today." James and I reviewed his will many times. I know his wishes by heart. The attorney hesitated, then exchanged a quick glance with the 2 men flanking him, both younger, both equally sharp-suited, and equally expressionless. Finally, he said, "Mrs. Foster, there have been developments. In his final weeks, your husband expressed some concerns. The words were oil on water, slick and calculated. Something in me snapped. 'Stop,' I said, louder than I meant, my hand flat on the table. The sound startled even me. 'What kind of concerns?' For the first time since I'd entered, Amber lifted her gaze to mine. Her eyes were wide, brimming with what might have passed for concern to anyone else. But I'd lived long enough, raised a child, buried a husband. I knew the difference between genuine worry and staged pity. And what I saw staring back at me across that table only confirmed what Frank had whispered in the garage. My own daughter-in-law was preparing to paint me as someone I was not. "Mrs. Foster," Amber began, her voice pitched so carefully soft it almost scraped, "James was worried about your health. He mentioned moments where you seemed confused, forgetful. He just wanted to be sure everything would be handled properly." The words landed on me like a slap, hot and humiliating. My breath hitched. "Incidents?" I shot back, my throat dry. "What incidents?" One of the younger attorneys, no older than my own son, slid a folder across the polished table. The scrape of it against the wood sounded obscene, like the dragging of a coffin lid. "Mrs. Ori Foster," he said flatly, "we've gathered documentation of several troubling episodes. Memory lapses, confusion with names and dates, difficulties handling money. Family members noted them with concern. My fingers trembled as I opened the folder. Inside lay neat stacks of paper. Medical reports stamped with seals I didn't recognize. Written statements, even photographs. My eyes snagged on one page and froze. The handwriting was all too familiar. Amber's. Her loopy cursive twisted into lies on a statement dated barely 6 weeks ago. My chest constricted as I read aloud, my voice shaking. Helen became extremely agitated when asked about grocery shopping. She couldn't remember what she had purchased or how much money she had spent. When Christopher tried to help her with receipts, she accused him of stealing from her. The words stung like acid, so precise, so cruelly fabricated that for a split second, I almost doubted myself. My hands quaked so violently the paper rattled against the table. "This is a lie," I managed, my voice breaking. "I have never accused my son of stealing anything." Amber leaned forward, her tone soft, her expression arranged into pity so polished it made me sick. "Helen, you did say those things. You just don't remember. We've all been worried." Her words slid through the room like poison, and for the first time in my life I felt the ground tilt beneath me, as though the people I trusted most were trying to erase the very reality I knew to be true. Amber leaned toward me with that syrupy tone I'd once mistaken for kindness, insisting they had only been worried about me, that James had wanted to protect me by putting safeguards in place. Her words coiled around me like smoke, suffocating in their falseness. I looked at her. This woman who had eaten at my table, helped decorate Christmas cookies beside me, hugged me every Thanksgiving, and realized I was staring into the face of a stranger. My voice cracked as I forced out the question, "What arrangements?" The lead attorney, his silver hair gleaming under the recessed lighting, cleared his throat with theatrical gravitas and explained that James had supposedly amended his will to establish a trust, one that would hand control of everything to my son, Christopher, while leaving me only with provisions for my care. The words made the room tilt, the polished walls and expensive art suddenly warping around me as though the air itself were unsteady. My hand clawed at the edge of the heavy table, the wood hard beneath my palm, as I tried to ground myself. My husband, my James, the man who had always relied on me to balance the books, who had teased me for being the family accountant, was now being used as a puppet in their story, as if he had doubted me in his final breath. "You're telling me he didn't trust me with our own money?" I managed, my voice quivering between outrage and disbelief. Amber jumped in quickly, eager to smooth over the sting. "It wasn't about trust," she insisted, her words rushing, her face performing concern. "It was about protection. He loved you, Helen. He just wanted to be sure you'd always be safe." I closed my eyes, forcing back the dizziness, clutching onto James's memory like a lifeline. This was not his voice, not his wish. He had never once implied I was incapable of caring for myself, never once suggested that my mind or my judgment was failing. The lies pressed down on me, layer after layer, until I could barely breathe. I opened my eyes again, desperate to anchor myself in reality, and that was when I noticed it. A tiny device tucked near the corner of the room, its red light blinking steadily like a watchful eye. For a heartbeat, I thought I was imagining it. But no, it was there, recording every word, every pause, every tremble in my voice. The realization sliced through me, sharper than anything said so far. "Are you recording this meeting?" I asked, my words cutting into the heavy silence. The attorneys stiffened, their polished confidence faltering as unease flickered across their faces. One of them muttered about standard practice, but the explanation rang hollow, an excuse rehearsed too many times. My skin prickled, every instinct screaming that this wasn't about documentation or procedure. It was about building a case against me, gathering ammunition they could twist into proof of their fabricated narrative. Sitting there in that gleaming conference room, surrounded by suits and betrayals, I felt the ground shift again, and for the first time, I understood the true scale of the trap I had walked into. One of the attorneys cleared his throat and muttered, "It's standard practice for estate settlements." The words slid over the table with the oily ease of a lie, but I latched onto them with disbelief. Standard practice? to record a grieving widow without so much as a warning, to capture her every hesitation and heartbeat for later use? My voice sharpened before I could stop it. Standard practice to record me without my consent? To document my grief like evidence? The air thickened, their eyes darting to one another, calculating how to diffuse me. And then came the softest interruption. A knock at the door. A secretary, her head barely inside the room, spoke quickly. "Mr. Holloway? There's someone here to see you. He says it's urgent." The lead attorney's frown deepened, his polished mask cracking for the first time. "We're in the middle of a meeting," he snapped. But the secretary persisted. "Sir, he says his name is Frank Doyle and he has information about this case." For a split second, the room held its breath, and I turned just in time to see the blood drain from Amber's face. She paled so suddenly I thought she might faint, right there at the table. Her fingers stopped their nervous twisting of the ring and lay frozen on the polished wood. I recognized the look. Panic. The kind you can't disguise even with years of practiced sweetness. "I don't know anyone by that name," Mr. Holloway said quickly, his voice sharp, dismissive, already gesturing for the secretary to leave. "Tell him we're busy." But before she could retreat, I stood, surprising even myself with the firmness in my tone. "Actually, I'd like to hear what Mr. Doyle has to say." The words dropped into the room like a stone, heavy and final. Amber's head jerked toward me, her voice higher than usual, a tremor in it I had never heard before. "Helen, I don't think that's necessary. We should just focus on the paperwork. Get through this as quickly as possible." Her urgency betrayed her, confirming more than she realized, but it was already too late. The door swung wider, and there he was. Frank Doyle, the man who had stopped me in the garage. Though he looked different now, cleaner, steadier, his hair combed back, though his worn jacket still didn't fit the elegance of the room. For a moment, the sight of him standing in that expensively lit conference room was almost surreal, like a figure from one world stepping boldly into another. He gave me a small nod, not deferential but respectful, the kind of acknowledgement that said, "I kept my word." "Mrs. Foster," he began, his voice calm, even, but carrying a weight that silenced the room. And as all eyes shifted to him, I realized this was the moment everything was about to change. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Frank began, his voice carrying more weight than any of the attorneys, "but I have something Mrs. Foster needs to see." The reaction was instant. Mr. Holloway shot to his feet so quickly his chair scraped against the marble floor with a screech that made me flinch. "Sir, you're trespassing," he barked, his composure unraveling. "I'm calling security." But Frank didn't so much as blink. He stood grounded, his presence filling the room in a way that none of their expensive suits could. "Go ahead," he said evenly, his tone calm but unyielding. "But first, Mrs. Foster should know that I have copies of the original documents. The real ones. The ones before they were altered." Silence hit the room like a tidal wave. It was as if the air had been sucked out of it, leaving only the sound of my own heartbeat thudding in my ears, pounding against my ribs so hard it felt like everyone could hear it. The attorneys froze, exchanging frantic glances, their confidence faltering in the space of a breath. Amber's face drained of what little color she had left, her lips parted, but no words came. For the first time, I saw her without her mask, and it terrified me more than anything she had said with her sweet, practiced voice. Frank stepped forward then, slow and deliberate, reaching into the battered messenger bag slung across his shoulder. The sight of that bag, worn and scuffed, but carried with such certainty, felt more powerful than any of the glossy binders stacked neatly on the lawyer's table. With careful hands, he drew out a thick manila folder, the edges frayed, the tab marked with James's name in bold, familiar letters. My throat tightened at the sight of it. not just because it bore my husband's name, but because I knew deep down this folder held the truth they had tried to bury. He placed the folder on the table with a soft thud, but to me it sounded like thunder. My eyes locked onto it. Every muscle in my body tensed, as though I were standing at the edge of a cliff about to leap. Around me, no one moved. The attorneys sat rigid, their power slipping through their fingers. Amber gripped her ring again, twisting, her knuckles white, and there I was, caught between fear and a flicker of something I hadn't felt in months, hope. Because in that moment I realized I wasn't alone in this fight. James's trust in me hadn't been misplaced, and Frank's courage might just be the lifeline I hadn't dared believe could come. Frank's voice was steady as he spread the papers across the polished table. I made copies before they fired me. Your husband's original will dated 6 months ago, along with the authentic reports from his doctor, not the manufactured ones they put in front of you. The air shifted instantly, heavy and electric. Amber pushed back from her chair, her body swaying as though the floor itself had tilted beneath her. I don't feel well, she stammered. I didn't recognize my own voice when I cut her off. It was harder, colder, stronger. Sit down, Amber. You're going to want to hear this. Frank's hand hovered over the documents like a dealer laying out cards in a high-stakes game. Mrs. Foster, your husband never changed his will. These men, he gestured toward the attorneys, whose faces had gone stiff with panic, conspired with your daughter-in-law to create false documents. They forged James's signature. They fabricated medical reports to make it appear as though he doubted you. Holloway sputtered, his thin lips curling. That's absurd. This man is delusional. We have witnesses who confirmed Mr. Foster's concerns about his wife's condition. Frank barely looked up as he replied, his tone almost gentle. You mean the witnesses you paid? I've got receipts for those bribes, too. Amber let out a strangled sound and collapsed back into her chair. For a moment I thought she had fainted, but her eyes flicked wildly around the room, trapped and frantic, like an animal caught in a snare. My chest constricted as I leaned forward, my voice barely more than a whisper. Why? Why would you do this to me? Her mouth opened and closed before words finally spilled out, jagged and desperate. Christopher and I have debts, the house, his business, everything's mortgaged to the hilt. You needed to steal from me, I finished, the truth searing my tongue. Frank slid the original will toward me, the paper trembling only slightly in his hand. Mrs. Foster, this is your husband's real will, properly signed and witnessed. Everything he owned belongs to you, just as you believed. My eyes blurred as James's familiar signature swam into focus. The loops, the slant of his handwriting, so deeply etched into my memory from decades of watching him sign birthday cards and checks. Seeing it here, untouched, unchanged, felt like hearing his voice again. Tears spilled as I traced the ink with my eyes. How long? I asked, lifting my gaze to Amber, her mascara streaking down her face. How long have you been planning this? She sobbed, her words tumbling out. It wasn't supposed to hurt you. We just wanted to be sure you'd be comfortable. The trust would have provided. While you controlled every penny, I cut in, fury rising like heat in my chest. Holloway shuffled papers, desperate to regain control. Mrs. Foster, this is all a misunderstanding. Perhaps we should reschedule. No, I snapped, my voice steadier than it had been all day. We're going to finish this right now. I looked around that room, at the woman who had smiled at me while plotting my ruin, and at the attorneys who sold their integrity for a paycheck. And I knew, for the first time since James's death, that I was done being anyone's victim. But my eyes kept drifting to Frank, this man who had no reason to stand beside me, no reward waiting at the end of all this, only risk. He'd stepped out of the shadows with nothing but a conscience and a battered messenger bag, and somehow that had been enough to bring down the walls they tried to build around me. "What happens now?" I whispered, the weight of the room pressing down on my shoulders. His jaw tightened as he glanced at the attorneys with open disgust. "Now," he said firmly, pulling his phone from his pocket, "we call the police." The word police sliced through the air like a bell tolling, final and undeniable. Amber let out a pitiful sob before collapsing forward, her head hitting the polished table with a dull thud. This time she didn't move, her performance of strength spent, and I felt nothing for her. No pity, no maternal softness, nothing but the cold realization that the woman crumpled in front of me had been a stranger all along. Those 20 minutes before the officers arrived stretched on endlessly, every tick of the wall clock digging into my chest. Amber eventually stirred, lifting her head with mascara streaks cutting black rivers down her cheeks. But she didn't bother with her old act. The mask was gone. The sweet smile, the gentle tone, the faux concern, all of it stripped away, leaving only a bitter hollowness I couldn't reconcile with the woman I thought I knew. She sat slumped in silence, eyes darting, waiting for rescue that wasn't coming. When the conference room door finally opened, it wasn't salvation she found, but judgment in the steady presence of Detective Diane Porter. Detective Porter was about my age, her short gray hair framing a face lined not by vanity but by wisdom. Her eyes were kind but unflinching, the kind that missed nothing, the kind I trusted instinctively. She listened without interrupting as Frank laid out everything he knew, each detail matched with the documents he'd salvaged. She studied the papers with the calm focus of someone who had seen every kind of lie and every desperate attempt to disguise the truth. When she finally looked up, she addressed me directly. "Mrs. Foster," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "I'll need you to tell me about your relationship with your daughter-in-law. From the beginning, my mind spun backward, unspooling 8 years of memories I thought were solid, only to find cracks running through them. I told her about the day Christopher brought Amber home, a bright-eyed 25-year-old dental hygienist with a laugh that seemed genuine, a young woman who looked at my son as if he were her whole world. James and I had opened our arms, certain she was the answer to every parent's prayers. She was perfect, I admitted to the detective, though my voice cracked. Too perfect. Always saying exactly what we wanted to hear, always agreeing with every word. I thought she was trying to fit in. Now I see it differently. And as I spoke, the memories rearranged themselves in darker hues. Her carefully timed compliments, her subtle steering of conversations, and then, 3 years ago, those tiny barbs hidden in concern. She'd ask if I remembered conversations that never happened, hint that I was misplacing things, forgetting details. It was never obvious, but enough to make me question myself. Amber's head jerked up then, her voice raw and defensive. "Helen, I was genuinely worried about you." But something inside me hardened, and I cut across her words with a strength I hadn't felt in years. "No, you weren't worried. You were planting seeds to make me doubt my own mind." Detective Porter's gaze shifted to Frank, her pen poised above her notebook, as if the story was finally slotting into place. Detective Porter's eyes stayed locked on Frank. "Mr. Doyle, tell me what you witnessed at the firm." He nodded and pulled a worn notebook from his bag, flipping it open with hands steadier than I would have expected given everything at stake. "About 6 months ago," he began, his voice level, "Mrs. Amber Foster started showing up at Holloway Legal Group more often. At first, Mr. Holloway told us she was just asking general questions about estate planning for her husband's family, but the meetings became more secretive, more frequent, and I noticed she always carried papers, medical records, statements, even photographs. Something about it felt wrong, so I started paying attention." He turned a page, his eyes scanning his own notes before lifting them back to the detective. I saw enough to know it wasn't innocent curiosity. Detective Porter leaned forward slightly. "What kind of photographs?" she asked. Amber shifted in her chair, her body coiling in on itself. Frank's jaw tightened as he answered, his voice rough with disgust. "Pictures of Mrs. Foster at the grocery store, at the bank, even at family gatherings. But they weren't just pictures. They were framed with lies. There's one of her at a checkout counter, perfectly normal, chatting with the cashier while her groceries were bagged. But the attached statement claims she was confused, unable to pay, unable to complete the purchase." The words made my stomach turn. My hands curled into fists, nails pressing into my palms. The violation was so sharp, so personal, it felt like someone had reached into my life and stolen pieces of it. I turned to Amber, my voice low and trembling with fury. "You were following me, photographing me like a criminal?" Her response was barely audible. "I needed documentation. They said we needed evidence." My anger boiled over. Evidence of what? Of me living my life, talking to a cashier, laughing with my friends? My voice shook, but not from weakness, from the strength of knowing I was right. Detective Porter scribbled notes calmly, her gaze darting between us. "Mrs. Foster, were you aware of any financial strain your son and daughter-in-law might have been under?" The question pierced me, and I shook my head. "No. Michael always said business was good. They live in a beautiful house in Westlake Hills, take vacations every year. I never suspected." It was Amber who broke the silence, her bitterness cutting through the room. "All of it was debt," she spat, her tears smearing black lines down her cheeks. "The house has 2 mortgages. His business is drowning. Those vacations, credit cards. We owe over $300,000. The number slammed into me like a punch to the gut. My son, my Christopher, drowning in debt, and I hadn't seen it, hadn't heard even a whisper. She pressed on, voice breaking. "He was too proud to tell you or James. He kept borrowing, thinking he could fix it. When James got sick, we realized the inheritance was our only way out." I stared at her, the daughter-in-law I had once embraced, now a stranger unraveling before me. "So instead of asking for help, you chose to betray me, to steal from me." She shook her head violently, insisting, "It wasn't stealing. You would have been cared for." But the words rang hollow, stripped bare in the heavy silence of that room. Frank's laugh was low, bitter, cutting through the air like broken glass. "A trust?" he scoffed. "A trust that would have paid you $40,000 a year, Mrs. Foster, while the rest of James's estate was drained to cover their credit cards and mortgages." I saw the calculations. My heart clenched as if his words had teeth. 40,000, an allowance. That was what my life would have been reduced to. A controlled stipend while the money James and I had built together was funneled into debts I hadn't even known existed. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about control, about Amber and my son weaving a net tight enough to strip me of independence and dignity. The question burned out of me before I could stop it. Does Christopher know? Is he part of this? Amber faltered, her lips parting but no sound coming at first. And in that pause, the answer settled in my gut. She finally admitted, "He knows about the debts. He knows we were hoping the inheritance would fix everything, but he doesn't know about the forged reports or the lies about your memory. He thinks James really did change his will because he was worried about you." Detective Porter's pen stopped mid-sentence as she lifted her gaze. "So your husband believes his father truly thought his mother was losing competence." Amber gave a miserable nod. "I've been feeding him stories for months. Little things that supposedly happened when he wasn't there. I made him believe James was worried." The room tilted, the edges of my vision blurring as her words sank in. Not only had she plotted against me with strangers in suits, she had turned my own son's heart against me, drip by drip, poisoning the bond I thought was unbreakable. My voice came out sharper than I intended, almost a demand. What incidents? Amber shrank into her chair, her voice barely audible. I told him you forgot to turn off the stove and nearly started a fire, that you got lost driving to the grocery store, that you accused the mailman of stealing, that you hid money in the house and couldn't remember where. I told him enough times that he believed it. Each lie landed in me like a blow, striking not just my mind but my soul. My hands trembled on the table, not from weakness but from rage. "None of that ever happened," I said, my voice shaking. "I know," she whispered, her tears running unchecked. Detective Porter closed her notebook with a firm snap. "Mrs. Foster, I'll need you to come to the station to give a formal statement, and I'll need copies of all of these documents." She turned her attention to the row of attorneys who had sat in stony silence, their expensive suits now looking like costumes, stripped of authority. "Gentlemen, we'll be investigating your involvement as well." Holloway finally found his voice, his tone oozing false indignation. "Detective, we acted on information given by our client. If it was false, we're as much victims as Mrs. Foster Frank let out a harsh laugh. Victims? You billed them $50,000 to forge documents and manufacture evidence. I have the invoices to prove it." The color drained from Holloway's face. We don't... Save it. Detective Porter cut him off, her voice slicing through the last of their pretense. And for the first time since James's death, I felt a shift, as though truth itself had walked into the room and decided to stay. The officers moved with calm efficiency, gathering evidence, bagging documents, taking down every detail as Detective Porter directed them. But my focus was on Amber, this woman who had called me Mom, who had helped decorate our Christmas tree, who had sat beside James's hospital bed, pretending to be a dutiful daughter-in-law while secretly plotting to erase me from his legacy. I asked her the only question that mattered. Was any of it real? The holidays, the dinners, the conversations. Was any of it real? For a moment her face softened, and tears that didn't look rehearsed streaked down her cheeks. "At first, yes," she whispered. "When I met Christopher. When we married, I cared about you and James. I cared about the family. But when the money problems got worse, when we realized what the estate was worth..." She didn't finish, but I didn't need her to. I understood the silence more than her words. Somewhere along the way, desperation had rotted her love into greed. That realization hollowed me out. If Frank hadn't stopped me in that garage, if he hadn't risked whatever little security he had left to tell me the truth, I would have walked into that room blind. I would have signed their papers. I would have believed James, the man who had trusted me with every check, every tax form, every decision of our life together, had doubted me in his final days. I would have lived the rest of my life thinking my husband had died disappointed in me. The thought made my knees buckle, and I sank into a chair, fighting the nausea of betrayal. They hadn't just tried to steal money. They had tried to steal the last piece of James's love, to rewrite his faith in me as weakness. When I looked up, my eyes landed on Frank, my unlikely guardian angel, worn jacket and tired eyes, standing taller than any of the men in their expensive suits. He had saved me from a fate worse than losing an inheritance. He had given me back the truth about James. That mattered more than any dollar amount. That was priceless. As the police led Amber and the lawyers away, I felt a chill that didn't come from fear, but from clarity. I was free of their lies, but I wasn't free of the choices left in front of me. What would I do with the truth now that it was mine again? 3 days later, I sat in my quiet kitchen, staring at my phone like it was a coiled snake. Christopher had called 17 times since Detective Porter reached out to him. 17 times I let the ringing fade into silence because I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready to know how much of Amber's poison had seeped into him, how much he believed about me. Frank had stopped by twice, dropping off extra copies of the documents, checking on me with a gentleness that stung because it highlighted just how absent my own family had been. This man, who slept in his car, cared more about my well-being than my own daughter-in-law ever had. The irony settled heavy in my chest, and then, right at 2 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I already knew who it was before I looked through the peephole. Christopher stood on my porch, shoulders slumped, face drawn, waiting for me to decide if I would open the door. When I opened the door, the sight of them nearly stopped my breath. Christopher looked wrecked, his usually polished hair mussed, his face gaunt with sleepless nights, his shoulders slumped like the weight of the world pressed down on him. And beside him, Amber stood shrunken, no trace of the polished young woman who once glowed in photographs. Her frame seemed smaller, her face pale, her eyes swollen from crying. For the briefest moment, I felt the ghost of the years we had shared. Birthdays, holidays, dinners. And then the memory curdled into something bitter. I didn't welcome them in. I let the silence stretch until Christopher's voice cracked on a single word. Mom. He sounded like a boy again, not the man of 33 he was supposed to be. We need to talk. I searched his face for the son I knew, the one who used to fall asleep with toy cars lined up neatly beside him, the one who called me every Sunday from college just to tell me about his week, the one James and I had poured so much hope into. Now he looked older than me, the dark crescents under his eyes, aging him past recognition. My voice came out sharper than I intended. Do we? The question hung between us like a wall. Please, Mom, he whispered, desperate. Let us come in. Let us explain against every instinct I stepped aside, not because I was ready to forgive, but because I needed answers. I needed to know how far he had been pulled into her web. They settled onto the living room couch, the one James and I had picked out 15 years ago, back when the kids were still young enough to sprawl across it during movie nights. I remembered the first time Amber had sat there, bright-eyed and eager, holding Christopher's hand as we welcomed her with open arms. That same couch now felt contaminated, soaked in the memory of deception. I stood, arms crossed, my body refusing the softness of sitting, as Christopher looked up at me with haunted eyes. Detective Porter told me everything, he said without hesitation, about the forged medical reports, the fake signatures, the lies about Dad changing his will. My arms tightened across my chest, my silence demanding more. And? I pressed, my voice low. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his head dropping into his hands before he looked up again. And I had no idea, Mom. I swear to you, I didn't know she was doing any of that. His voice cracked with something between shame and desperation. I studied him. This boy I had birthed, the one James and I had raised with every ounce of love we had, the man who was supposed to be my protector, not my betrayer. I searched his eyes for the truth, praying to find it and terrified of what it would mean if I didn't. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. 33 years of loving my son without hesitation, and now his words felt like tiny knives pressed into my skin. So when your father got sick, you started thinking about the inheritance, I said, my voice trembling with fury and heartbreak. Christopher recoiled as if my words had slapped him across the face. Not like that, he insisted, desperation lacing every syllable. Not the way you're making it sound. My eyes burned as I leaned closer. Then how, Christopher? Explain it to me, because all I see is betrayal. Before he could speak, Amber's fragile voice cracked through the silence. Christopher, tell her the truth. All of it. I turned toward her, startled. The woman hunched on my couch looked nothing like the slick manipulator I had faced in that law office. Her shoulders were slumped, her face blotched with tears, her voice small and trembling. She looked broken, stripped of every ounce of control. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if this was her truest self. Not the conniving conspirator, but the desperate woman she had become. My son's hands raked through his hair, tugging as though he could rip out the shame that clung to him. His words tumbled out haltingly. When Dad got his diagnosis, When we knew he only had months left, I panicked. Not just about losing him, but about you, about what would happen to you in this house, alone, managing all of it yourself. I could feel my anger boiling up, unstoppable. I am 64 years old, Christopher, I said, my voice sharp and unflinching. Not 94. Do you really think I'm incapable of living my life? Do you think I spent decades building this home, raising you, managing every bill, every account, every decision, just to fall apart the moment your father was gone? My voice cracked, but did not waver. The only thing I needed from you was honesty, not protection, and certainly not deception. The silence after my words was so heavy it pressed against my chest, as if even the house itself was holding its breath. Christopher's face crumpled further, his shame spilling out of him in waves. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he whispered, his voice raw. "I thought if I could just hold everything together until after Dad was gone, you wouldn't have to carry the weight." His hands shook as he buried his face in them, muffling a sob. For the first time, I saw my son not as the man he was supposed to be, but as the frightened boy he still was, making desperate choices he couldn't undo. And as much as part of me longed to reach out, to comfort him, another part hardened with the knowledge that love doesn't erase betrayal and excuses don't restore broken trust. "I know," Christopher said softly, his shoulders sagging, "but Amber kept pointing out little things. Times when you seemed confused, forgetful. She said Dad had even mentioned being worried about you." My anger flared hot, sharp enough to cut through the sorrow. "What little things?" I demanded. He shifted uncomfortably, his hands twisting together. "Like when you forgot about our dinner plans last Christmas, or when you couldn't remember the name of the neighbor's new dog, or when you put the milk in the pantry instead of the refrigerator." I stared at him, disbelief washing over me. "Christopher," I said firmly, "you canceled dinner at the last minute because Amber was sick." I didn't forget. "And the neighbor's dog? His name is Butterscotch, and I knew that perfectly well. And yes, I once left the milk in the pantry, after working in the garden for 3 hours in the Texas heat. That doesn't make me senile. It makes me human." His face showed genuine confusion, his eyes darting between me and Amber like a child caught between two versions of reality. "But Amber said—" "Amber lied," I cut in flatly, my voice cold and final. "She lied about everything." Tears streamed silently down her face, streaks of mascara marking her collapse. Her voice was a whisper, trembling with guilt. I twisted things. I took ordinary moments, things that happened to anyone, and I made them sound like symptoms. I made it look like you were slipping when you weren't. I wanted Christopher to believe there was a problem where there wasn't one. Christopher's face drained of color, his body folding in on itself as though the floor had given way beneath him. "Why?" he asked, his voice raw, the single word dragged from him like a wound. Amber's eyes were wide and broken. "Because I was desperate," she choked out. "Because we were drowning in debt, and I thought if Christopher believed you couldn't manage the estate, he'd let us take over. I thought it was the only way to save us." Her words fell into the silence like stones, each one heavier than the last, and in that moment the weight of betrayal became unbearable. "Because we were losing everything," Amber whispered, her shoulders sagging under the weight of her own admission. "And I thought if Christopher believed his mother needed help managing the estate, maybe he'd be more willing to let us handle things for her." Her words slithered through the air, and I felt my anger coil tight inside me. I repeated her phrase slowly, each syllable deliberate. "Handle things? You mean steal from me?" My voice was sharper than I'd ever heard it, but I didn't soften. This wasn't misunderstanding. It was betrayal. Amber shook her head quickly, her tears running unchecked, mascara leaving black traces down her face. "No," she protested, her voice small, fragile. "We would have taken care of you. You would have had everything you needed." I leaned forward, my eyes burning into hers. "Under your control," I snapped. $40,000 a year. That's what you planned for me. An allowance like I was a child. While you used James's money, my husband's life's work, to cover your credit cards, your mortgages, all the debts you hid." Christopher's head jerked up, his entire body stiffening. "What are you talking about?" His voice cracked with disbelief, his eyes searching mine for reassurance, for denial, for anything but the truth he already sensed was waiting for him. I didn't flinch. "Ask your wife," I said coldly, my tone slicing through the air. "Ask her about the trust she had the lawyers draft. Ask her how much of the estate was designed to pay off your debts while I lived on scraps, while I was stripped of independence in the very house your father and I built together." I watched as the realization crept across my son's face, the horror dawning slowly and then all at once, leaving him pale, his lips parted in disbelief. It was the look of a man who suddenly understood just how deeply he had been manipulated by the woman he loved, how thoroughly he had allowed her lies to rewrite the truth. "Amber," he whispered, his voice shaking, barely audible in the heavy silence. "Tell me she's wrong. Please tell me this isn't true." But Amber couldn't even lift her eyes to meet his. Her silence screamed louder than any admission, and in that moment I saw not just my daughter-in-law's guilt, but my son's world collapsing beneath him. "Not ever," I said firmly, my voice steady though my heart pounded in my chest. "Your father's will was never changed. He never questioned my ability to manage our affairs. The man you knew, the father who raised you, trusted me completely until the day he died." My words hung heavy in the room, and I saw Christopher's face crumble, the defenses falling away as the truth broke through. He sobbed, the sound raw and unguarded, and for a moment I saw not the grown man in front of me, but the little boy he had once been, crying into my arms when the world felt too heavy. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he choked out between tears. "I'm so sorry I believed her. I should have known you better than that." My voice softened, though it carried no mercy. "You should have," I said quietly. But she was very good at what she did. I turned to Amber then, and she couldn't even lift her gaze. Her hands trembled in her lap as though she was still trying to hide behind silence. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked her, my words deliberate, sharp. "When did you decide I was the enemy?" She shook her head quickly, whispering, "You were never the enemy." But when the debt started piling up, when we realized we might lose everything, I started thinking about the inheritance differently. Her voice cracked, her eyes darting as if the walls themselves might close in. She was no longer the confident woman who had smiled at me across family dinners. She was stripped down to desperation, cornered and small. Then came the words that made my skin crawl. "Your husband's estate is worth over $2 million, Helen," she said, her tone carrying a hollow echo of justification. "That money could solve all our problems." I felt the heat rise in me, anger burning through my chest. "That money was James's life's work," I said, each syllable firm. "Money he saved so I could live comfortably after he was gone. Not for you to patch the holes of a sinking ship you kept secret from me." The tension in the room thickened, and Christopher buried his face in his hands again, as though each admission from his wife cut him deeper. Amber's head snapped up suddenly, and for the first time I saw not sorrow but resentment flicker across her tear-stained face. "You don't need $2 million, she spat, bitterness lacing her words. "You live simply. You don't travel. You don't spend money on expensive things. That money would just sit there while we lost our house, our car, everything." The venom in her voice made me shiver, not because it frightened me, but because it revealed the truth of who she had become. She didn't see me as a mother-in-law or even as family. She saw me as an obstacle, as someone hoarding what she believed she deserved. And in that moment, any illusion of love or loyalty between us shattered completely. And there it was at last, the mask slipping completely, the real Amber laid bare in my living room. Not the smiling young woman who had once hugged me at Christmas or called me Mom with practiced sweetness, but the one who believed she was more entitled to James's legacy than I was, because she would spend it while I would save it, because in her twisted logic, stealing wasn't theft at all, but some warped act of necessity. She had convinced herself that her desperation was noble, that my husband's gift to me was wasted simply because I chose to live within my means. It chilled me, hearing her say aloud what I had long suspected, that in her eyes, I didn't deserve what James left me. Christopher looked at his wife then, really looked, as though he was seeing her for the very first time. His face was pale, his voice cracked, almost broken. "Amber," he whispered, "how could you think like that? How could you believe you had any right to my father's estate? To my mother's inheritance?" And Amber, cornered and unraveling, abandoned all pretense. Her voice rose sharp and bitter. "Because she doesn't need it," she shouted, her words cutting through the air. "Because we do. Because you were too stubborn and too proud to ask for help when we needed it." The silence that followed her outburst pressed down on us all, heavy and suffocating. I felt my own fury surge back, steady and strong. "So instead of asking," I said, my voice low but firm, "you decided to take, to steal, to turn my son against me with lies, to pay lawyers to forge documents, to erase the trust your father had in me. And you call that help?" The only sounds in the room were Amber's ragged sobs and Christopher's uneven breathing, the sound of a marriage cracking beneath the weight of truth. Finally, Christopher turned to me, his voice hollow, stripped of its certainty. "Mom, what happens now?" The question seemed to echo around the room, though I had been asking myself the same thing for days. What did happen now? My daughter-in-law had woven an elaborate web of deceit, forged medical records, falsified signatures, nearly succeeded in robbing me not just of money, but of my husband's final expression of faith in me. My son, blinded by love, had doubted his own mother's mind. And the very lawyers paid to protect James's wishes had been willing to sell them off to the highest bidder. But beneath all of it lay something deeper, something heavier. A question not about money or property, but about trust, family, and whether what was broken could ever be made whole again. Could this family be saved? The question gnawed at me as I stood in that room, my eyes moving between my son and his wife. Christopher sat there drowning in remorse, his face hollowed by guilt, while Amber looked small but still carried that faint spark of defiance, even in her defeat. "That depends," I said at last, my voice steady but cold, "on what you're both willing to do to make this right." The silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever. Christopher's head sank into his hands as if he could hide from the wreckage of his own choices, while Amber's eyes fixed on the floor. Her tears dried, but her shame laid bare. I didn't move. I stood waiting because in that silence I wanted to see them stripped of their excuses, to find out who they really were beneath the layers of lies and desperation. It was Christopher who broke first. "What do you want us to do, Mom?" His voice was hoarse, almost childlike, and for a moment I was thrust back in time to when he was little, pleading for forgiveness after breaking something he couldn't replace. But this wasn't a broken vase. This was trust. This was legacy. This was the bond between a mother and her son, splintered nearly beyond repair. For 3 sleepless nights I had turned that question over in my mind, tossing between rage and heartbreak, between the thirst for justice and the longing for something I feared might never return. Trust. "I want the truth," I said finally, each word deliberate. All of it. Every lie, every manipulation, every moment you chose to doubt me instead of trust me. Christopher lifted his head then, his eyes red and swollen, his face drawn. "I'll tell you everything I know," he whispered. "But Mom, I swear to you, I thought I was protecting you." His words struck me like cold water. Protecting me? By destroying me? I clenched my arms tighter around myself, willing the anger not to explode too quickly. He pressed on, desperate to be understood. "Amber convinced me that Dad was worried about your memory, that he wanted to make sure you were taken care of. She said he'd spoken about it before he died." His words faltered, shame dragging them down. "How?" I demanded, my voice rising sharper than I intended. "What exactly did she tell you?" My son glanced sideways at his wife, but Amber still refused to meet his eyes. She sat frozen, staring at the floor as though the truth itself were carved there in stone. The silence around us grew so dense it was almost suffocating, every second heavier than the last. I could see the battle on Christopher's face, the pull between loyalty to the woman he had chosen and the need to finally free himself from the weight of her lies. And I realized then that this wasn't just about whether I could forgive him. It was about whether he could forgive himself for believing her in the first place. "She said Dad had mentioned it to her during one of his doctor visits," Christopher admitted, his voice trembling, "that he was concerned about leaving you with so much responsibility." A cold shiver ran down my spine. "Amber was with James at his doctor visits?" I asked, my words sharp and clipped. "Sometimes," my son said, shame heavy in his tone. "When I couldn't get away from work, she offered to drive him, to help with medications and appointments." I turned slowly toward her, my anger steady now, not explosive but cold and cutting. "You used my husband's illness, his final fragile months, as an opportunity to manipulate my son." Amber finally raised her head, her eyes swollen, her voice cracking. "Harold never said anything about being worried about you," she admitted, "but he was so weak, so dependent on others near the end. It made it easy to suggest things." My stomach turned at her choice of words. "Suggest to whom?" I demanded. "To Christopher," she whispered. "I would mention things when we got home from the appointments." How frail Harold looked, how much he was leaning on you. I made it sound like Harold was concerned about what would happen to you after he was gone. The way she twisted love into suspicion, support into weakness, made me want to scream, but I held my voice steady. The betrayal cut deeper than I thought possible. She had taken my husband's final months, sacred, painful, fleeting days, when every look and every word should have been about love and comfort, and turned them into a weapon. She had poisoned those moments, not just against me, but against the man I loved, making it seem as though he had doubts he never carried. The rage in me burned hot, but I would not give her the satisfaction of seeing me collapse. My voice came low, controlled. "What else?" I asked, the demand hanging in the air like a knife. Amber fumbled for a tissue, wiping her nose, her face blotched with shame and desperation. "I started watching everything you did," she confessed. "Every time you misplaced your keys, every time you asked someone to repeat themselves, every little slip that happens to everyone. I twisted it all, made it sound like evidence of decline." She dropped her gaze again, her voice shrinking into the silence. "I made normal life look like proof that you couldn't be trusted." Christopher's head dropped into his hands as if her words were physical blows, and I stood there, my fury cold and unrelenting, realizing she had used my grief, my husband's weakness, and my son's love as tools in her scheme. "I would mention it to Christopher later," Amber said, her voice trembling, "and I'd make it sound concerning." My eyes snapped to my son. "And you believed her?" I asked, my words cutting like ice. He shifted uncomfortably, his face pale. "She was so subtle about it, Mom. She never outright said you were slipping. She'd just bring things up casually, like she was worried but didn't want to upset anyone. Over time, it started to feel like there was a pattern, and I convinced myself it was real." His voice cracked, and the shame in his eyes pierced me, but my anger only deepened. Lies had been drip-fed into his ears until he no longer trusted the woman who had raised him. I thought back over the past year, replaying every interaction, every glance, every dinner conversation where Amber had smiled too sweetly or watched me too closely. Had she been studying me, cataloging my ordinary mistakes, feeding them to my son as proof of decline? My mind flashed to the photographs, the ones Eddie had shown me, distorted evidence twisted into a weapon. The photographs, I said suddenly, my voice low but sharp. When did you start following me? Amber shifted in her seat, her shoulders hunching like a child caught in a lie. About 4 months ago, she admitted, her tone bitter with resignation. The lawyers said they would need documentation if we were going to challenge your competency. The words hit me like a thunderclap. Challenge my competency, I repeated slowly, each syllable tasting of betrayal. You were planning to have me declared mentally unfit. My voice wavered only slightly, but the rage underneath was steady, cold, unyielding. Christopher's head shot up, panic flooding his face. No, that's not what we discussed, he said quickly, desperate to distance himself. His denial landed weakly, already too late. Amber's head jerked toward him, her eyes flashing, her voice sharp and unrestrained. That's exactly what we discussed, she snapped, the mask of tears and fragility cracking as venom spilled through. You knew what the lawyers were suggesting. You just didn't want to say it out loud. Her words cut through the room like a blade, and I stood frozen, my heart hammering, realizing the depths to which they had sunk. They hadn't only planned to take my money. They had been willing to erase me entirely, to rewrite me as a woman too broken to be trusted with her own life. Christopher, stop pretending you didn't know what this was about, Amber said suddenly, her voice sharp with frustration. We talked about setting up a conservatorship, about making sure your mother was protected from making bad financial decisions. My son's face went white, his lips parting in disbelief. I thought we were talking about helping her manage things, he stammered, not taking away her rights. Amber turned to him, her tone unyielding. They're the same thing. A conservatorship would have protected her while ensuring the money was used responsibly. My chest tightened as I forced myself to meet her eyes. Responsibly, I repeated. You mean to pay off your debts? The debts were destroying us, Amber shot back, her voice rising with desperation. Do you have any idea what it's like to lose everything? To have creditors calling you every day, threatening to take your house, your car, everything you've built? My anger surged, raw and cutting. Do you have any idea what it's like to discover your own family has been plotting against you? I demanded. To learn that the people you trusted most in this world were planning to have you declared incompetent so they could take your money? Christopher lifted his head, his voice breaking. We weren't going to steal anything, he protested weakly. The trust would have provided for you. Christopher, I said, my voice gentler now because I could see he was finally grasping the truth. The trust your wife and those lawyers designed would have given me $40,000 a year, while the rest of your father's estate paid off your debts. And after 5 years, when it was all gone, what then? His face paled further, horror dawning as the implications took root. There wouldn't have been anything left, he whispered. Nothing, I confirmed. Your father worked 45 years, saved every penny, invested carefully, built a future for me so I could live comfortably after he was gone. And your wife's plan would have wiped it all away. Amber stood abruptly, her cheeks flushed, her eyes burning. It's easy for you to judge, Helen, she snapped. You've never been in debt. You've never faced losing everything. You don't know what desperation feels like. I steadied my voice, cold but clear. You're right. I don't know what it's like to live in your situation, but I do know what it feels like to be betrayed by people I love, to realize someone I welcomed into my family was willing to destroy me to save herself. Amber's face flickered with something softer then, a glimmer of recognition. I wasn't trying to destroy you, she whispered. I was trying to save my marriage, my family, my life. Her words hung heavy in the room, and for the first time I saw in her eyes the shadow of understanding, the faint trace of regret. Christopher rose and walked to the window, staring out at the garden. James and I had planted 2 decades ago, his voice hollow. What happens to us now, Mom? To our family? It was the question I had dreaded, because deep down I knew the truth. I didn't know if we could come back from this. Trust, once shattered so completely, might never be pieced back together. I stood there in my own living room, my voice steady though my heart ached, and said the words I knew had to be spoken. The lawyers will face criminal charges. Eddie has provided more than enough evidence to prove their involvement in forgery and fraud. Christopher didn't turn from the window when he asked quietly, "And Amber?" I looked at the woman who had once seemed so perfect when he first brought her through our front door, the woman I had embraced as a daughter. That, I said slowly, depends on what she does next. Amber's eyes flickered toward me, searching for some trace of mercy. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice raw. Detective Porter told me that if you cooperate fully with the investigation, if you testify against the lawyers and help expose how this scheme worked, the district attorney might consider a plea agreement. But if you don't, then you'll face the full consequences of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy charges. Eddie's evidence is more than enough to convict you without your cooperation. She sank back into the couch as though the cushions themselves had swallowed her. "What kind of plea agreement?" she asked faintly. "I don't know," I admitted. "That will be between you, your attorney, and the district attorney. But understand this, Amber. Even if you avoid prison, even if they offer you probation, this doesn't go away. You tried to strip me of everything. My security, my dignity, my husband's legacy. That stain doesn't wash out." Her face crumpled, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I thought I saw something real. Not performance, not manipulation, but remorse. "I was wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can see that now. I let desperation twist me into someone I don't even recognize, someone willing to destroy an innocent person to save myself. I never meant—" She trailed off, but the silence was enough. For once, she wasn't hiding behind excuses or rationalizations. It was an admission, small but heavy, like a stone finally dropped after being carried too long. And though it didn't heal the wound, it marked the first honest thing I had heard from her in months. Christopher finally turned from the window, his face wet with tears he hadn't bothered to wipe away. "Mom," he said, his voice ragged, "is there any way, any possibility that we can fix this? That our family can survive this?" I looked at my son, the boy I had raised to be honest, the man I had hoped would be strong, now broken by the woman he loved and the choices he made. Then I looked at Amber, the architect of this betrayal, the one who had planted the seeds of doubt and nearly destroyed us all. "I don't know," I said truthfully, the weight of it pressing on my chest. "But I do know what has to happen first. Amber has to face the consequences of what she's done. She has to cooperate with the police, testify against the lawyers, and accept whatever punishment the court decides is right. And Christopher, you have to decide whether you can stay married to someone who was willing to do this to your mother." His face crumpled further, the conflict tearing through him. "Mom," he whispered, "she's my wife." "I love her." I met his eyes and nodded slowly. "I know you do." "I know you love her," I said softly, my eyes on Christopher. "But love isn't always enough. Trust is the foundation of any relationship, and she didn't just betray me, she betrayed you too. She manipulated you, lied to you, used your love for me as a weapon against both of us." Amber leaned forward, desperation etched in every line of her face. "I can change," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "I can be better. I can earn back your trust." My heart hardened as I shook my head. "Can you?" Because this wasn't one bad choice, Amber. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This was months of planning, months of lies, months of watching me live my ordinary life while plotting to dismantle it. This wasn't something you slipped into. This was who you chose to be. The room sank into silence so deep I could hear the sound of children laughing outside, the bounce of a basketball, a dog barking in the distance. Ordinary sounds of ordinary lives carrying on untouched, while mine had been cracked open. Christopher sat rigid, staring at his hands as though they held the answer. Finally, he lifted his head, his voice quiet but steady. "What do you want from us, Mom?" I stood straighter, drawing in a breath that felt like a line drawn in the sand. "I want you both to choose," I said firmly. "Choose who you want to be going forward. Choose whether you'll live as people who face the consequences of their actions or people who keep inventing excuses to hide behind." It wasn't the answer they wanted. I could see it in Christopher's wounded eyes, in Amber's defeated posture. But it was the only answer I had. Because the truth was, I couldn't decide their futures for them. I couldn't force my son to walk away from a marriage built on betrayal, no more than I could force his wife to shed the person she had chosen to become. The only power left to me was deciding what I would accept in my own life. And I knew with absolute clarity I could no longer accept betrayal from those who claimed to love me. 6 months later, I sat in my garden on a crisp October morning, the air sharp with the scent of fallen leaves. I watched the maple tree James and I had planted for Christopher's 10th birthday blaze with color, its leaves turning gold and crimson, reminding me that seasons change whether we're ready or not. The house was quieter now, but I had reclaimed it piece by piece, filling it with the peace that had been stolen from me. And as I sipped my coffee beneath that tree, I understood that survival wasn't about fixing everything or everyone. It was about choosing myself, about honoring the trust my husband had left in me, and about never again mistaking someone's desperation for love. The seasons had a way of teaching lessons we never asked for. What felt solid and unchangeable in spring could crumble by autumn, reshaped into something we hardly recognized. Amber had taken the plea agreement, and though it spared her prison, it didn't spare her reputation or her marriage. 3 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and restitution of every cent paid to Holloway Legal Group. The lawyers hadn't been as fortunate. Mr. Holloway was sentenced to 4 years, his associates to 2 each. And through it all, Frank stood steady, his meticulous notes and brave testimony becoming the cornerstone that ensured none of them escaped justice. He had been the unexpected thread holding truth together when everything else was fraying apart. But the law's gavel didn't close the wounds in my family. Healing was slower, messier, more painful. Christopher moved out of the house he had shared with Amber just 3 weeks after our confrontation in my living room, finally stepping out from the shadow she had cast over him. He rented a modest apartment downtown, a place with bare walls and secondhand furniture, and every time I visited him, I could see how lost he was, trying to rebuild himself piece by fragile piece. We met once a week for coffee, and in those meetings I watched him second-guess every story, every memory, every word she had ever whispered to him. It was as though his entire marriage had been rewritten in hindsight, and he was left sifting through the rubble, unsure of what was real. For me, the hardest part hadn't been watching Amber fall. It had been watching my son untangle himself from her lies and realize how far he had drifted from me. I could see the shame in his eyes each time he looked at me, as if he believed a lifetime of love could be erased by 2 years of doubt. But I reminded him, gently, that shame only has power if you let it define you. Trust is fragile, yes, but forgiveness is a choice. And though I couldn't offer it to Amber, I could extend it to my son, slowly, carefully, piece by piece, because James would have wanted that, and because deep down, I still did. And so 6 months after everything unraveled, I sat once more in my garden, beneath the maple tree James and I had planted when Christopher turned 10, and I felt the crisp October air sting my cheeks. The leaves blazed with color, proof that endings could still hold beauty. The legal battles were over, the criminals punished, the schemes dismantled. But the story of us, of my family, was still being written in quieter ways, in coffee shop conversations, in cautious laughter that began to creep back between Christopher and me. I realized then that survival wasn't about erasing the pain or pretending it hadn't happened. It was about reclaiming my life, honoring James's faith in me, and planting new seeds of trust, even if they took years to bloom again. How much of it was really me? And how much was her telling me what to think? Christopher had asked me once over coffee, and the question lingered with me long after. I knew it too well. I had spent months replaying conversations, sifting through memories, trying to untangle truth from the web of lies Amber had spun so carefully into our daily lives. The divorce was nearly finalized by then, and in the process, Christopher had uncovered even more betrayal than either of us expected. Credit cards opened in his name without his consent, loans taken out against his business, reckless spending that had been hidden behind sweet smiles and soft excuses. The financial mess was worse than we had ever imagined, and though I offered to help, he had refused with a kind of quiet strength. "Mom, I can't take your money to clean up the mess my wife made. I need to figure this out on my own, the right way this time." It broke my heart to watch him struggle, but it also filled me with pride. He had sold the house in Westlake Hills, let go of the BMW he once prized, and now drove a 10-year-old Honda to and from his long days at the office. 16-hour shifts, rebuilding his consulting firm from the ground up, left him tired. But there was a light in his eyes again, a determination that reminded me of the boy I had raised. Honest, hard-working, resilient. For the first time in years, I could see the man he was meant to be, not the shadow Amber had convinced him to become. Watching him reclaim his integrity, even while walking through hardship, was painful and beautiful all at once. Frank had become an unexpected constant in my own life, someone I hadn't realized I needed until he was there. I hired him as a part-time groundskeeper, and he moved into the little apartment above James's old workshop. Watching his transformation, from a man sleeping in his car to someone with stability and purpose, became one of the few bright threads woven into those dark months. That morning, as I sat in the garden, I saw him walking across the lawn carrying a tray with 2 steaming mugs. "Mrs. Foster," he called out warmly. "Thought you might like some company today," I smiled as he lowered himself into the chair beside me, his presence grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. "Thank you, Frank," I said, wrapping my hands around the cup he offered. He gave me a thoughtful look. "How are you feeling about today?" It was the day Amber's probation officer was coming to verify her community service hours. She'd been assigned to work at the food bank, preparing and serving meals for people without homes. People Frank had known all too well not long ago. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. "I hope she's learning something," Frank said quietly. "Not everyone who ends up desperate makes the choices she made." He was right. Frank had lost his job, his home, his comfort, but never his moral compass. When faced with the chance to profit from corruption, he had chosen integrity, even at the cost of everything else. "Have you seen her lately?" I asked. Frank nodded slowly. "Sometimes, when I'm at the food bank picking up supplies for the church. She doesn't say much, but she works hard. I think she's finally starting to understand what desperation really looks like," Frank said quietly, and I wasn't sure how I felt about that. Part of me wanted Amber to suffer, to truly feel the weight of the harm she had caused, but a larger part of me just wanted her to change, to become someone better, someone who would never again be capable of the cruelty she had shown me. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from Christopher. "Coffee later. I have some news." I tilted the screen toward Frank, who raised an eyebrow and gave me a knowing smile. "Think it's good news or bad?" he asked. I sighed. With Christopher these days, it's usually both. That afternoon, my son arrived at the house looking healthier than I had seen him in months. The sharp edges of stress that had carved into his face during the divorce had softened, and there was color in his cheeks again. As we settled into the kitchen with steaming cups of coffee between us, I smiled. "You look good," I told him honestly. "I feel good, Mom," he said, his voice lighter than it had been in years. "Really good. For the first time in forever, I feel like I'm living my own life instead of drowning in someone else's crises." He pulled out his phone and turned the screen toward me, showing a photo of a small storefront with Foster Consulting painted neatly across the window. "I signed the lease yesterday," he said with a grin. "My own office, my own business, built the right way this time." Pride swelled so fiercely in my chest that it almost hurt. "Your father would be so proud of you," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. Christopher nodded, his expression turning thoughtful. "I hope so." I've been thinking about Dad a lot lately, about the values he tried to teach me, about the kind of man he wanted me to be. I lost sight of that for a while. My hand reached across the table almost instinctively, resting over his. "We all did," I said gently, "but we found our way back." His fingers tightened around mine, his eyes shining with something vulnerable, something raw. "Mom," he said softly, "I need to ask you something. And I need you to be honest with me." I gave his hand a squeeze. "Always." He swallowed hard, his voice trembling. "Can you ever forgive me? Really forgive me? Not just say it because you love me, but truly mean it." The question I had been asking myself for months now lay bare between us. Could I forgive my son for doubting me, for being manipulated into nearly destroying my life? I drew in a breath, steady but heavy. "Forgiveness isn't something that happens all at once," I said carefully. "It's a choice I make every single day." Some days it comes easier than others. His eyes filled with tears, but I pressed on. "But yes, Christopher, I can forgive you. I have forgiven you. Because I see now that you were a victim too. Amber used your love for me against both of us. And that wasn't your fault." He bowed his head, shame trembling in his voice. "It feels like it was my fault. I should have known better. I should have trusted you more than I trusted her." I squeezed his hand again, my voice firm. "You should have. But we're here now, and that means we still have a chance to rebuild." "But you didn't," I said gently, "and we can't change that. What we can do is build something better going forward." Christopher wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, his voice small. "What does that look like?" I drew a steadying breath, choosing each word with care. "It looks like honesty. Complete honesty, even when it's uncomfortable. It looks like you coming to me when you're struggling instead of trying to carry the weight alone. It looks like us rebuilding trust one conversation at a time." His lips trembled. "And if I mess up again?" I smiled softly. "Then we'll deal with it together." "But Christopher, you're not the same man you were 6 months ago. You've learned something about yourself, about the choices you make when you're desperate, and that knowledge will protect you from falling into the same trap again." We sat in silence after that, not the heavy silence of accusation, but the gentle kind, the kind that comes after truth has finally been spoken aloud. The ticking of the kitchen clock, the faint rustle of leaves outside, the hum of life carrying on, it all felt like background music to a moment I knew I would never forget. We had come so far through grief, through betrayal, through lies that could have broken us forever, and yet here we were, sitting together with coffee between us, daring to believe that trust could be rebuilt one brick at a time. After a while, Christopher's voice broke the quiet. "What about Amber?" My eyes narrowed slightly. "What about her?" He hesitated, his fingers tracing the rim of his cup. "Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive her?" The question landed heavy, one I had been asking myself in the quiet hours of the night. turning it over like a stone in my hands. "I don't know," I admitted at last. "What she did wasn't a mistake made in a single moment. It was calculated, deliberate, cruel. She didn't just stumble into wrongdoing, she spent months planning it. And in some ways, I think she enjoyed the power it gave her." Christopher's eyes searched mine, filled with a quiet hope I couldn't quite return. "She says she's changed," he whispered. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of truth pressing against my chest. Maybe she has. People can change, Christopher. But forgiveness is not something I owe her. It's something she would have to earn, and I'm not sure she ever will. I can't answer that today, and maybe I won't be able to answer it tomorrow, but I know this. I will never again give her the power to define my worth or rewrite my truth. That part of me is mine, and mine alone. But forgiveness isn't really about whether someone has changed, I said slowly, my voice calm and firm. It's about whether I'm willing to carry the weight of anger and resentment. And I've decided I'm not. So no, I haven't forgiven Amber in the way you mean. I've simply let go of the anger. That's not the same as forgiveness, and it's certainly not the same as trust. She will never be welcome in my life again, but I refuse to let her steal any more of my peace. Christopher nodded, his eyes shining with understanding, or maybe relief. "I think I get it now," he whispered. As he prepared to leave, I walked him to the door, the weight between us lighter than it had been in months. The sun was setting over the neighborhood, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and violet. It was the kind of sunset James and I had watched so many times from our back porch, his hand wrapped around mine as we talked about our dreams for the years ahead. "Mom," Christopher said softly as he hugged me, "thank you for not giving up on me." I held him close, my throat tight with emotion. "Thank you for finding your way back," I whispered. And in that embrace, I felt a fragile but undeniable thread of hope. When the house was quiet again, I walked slowly through each room, my footsteps echoing against walls that carried 4 decades of memories. This home James and I had built together, brick by brick, dream by dream, no longer felt haunted by betrayal. The silence inside wasn't empty anymore. It was peaceful, steady, grounding. I had thought losing James meant facing the rest of my life alone, but I had been wrong. What these painful months had shown me was that solitude wasn't the same as loneliness. I wasn't alone. I had people who genuinely cared. Christopher finding his way back to himself and to me. Frank with his quiet loyalty and strength. Neighbors who checked in. Even strangers who had become unlikely allies. Life had shifted, reshaped by grief and betrayal, but also by resilience and love. As the last streaks of sunlight faded from the sky, I understood something James had always tried to teach me. We can't choose what storms come our way, but we can choose how we weather them, and I was still standing. Frank, whose loyalty and courage had saved me from a terrible fate. Christopher, who was working every day to become the man he was meant to be. Detective Porter, who still called from time to time just to check in on me. Even the staff at the food bank where Amber was completing her community service had become unexpected friends after I began volunteering there myself. My days were no longer defined by grief or betrayal, but by purpose. I tutored adults at the library who were learning to read. I helped Frank expand the garden behind James's old workshop, and I worked with Detective Porter's department to teach other seniors how to recognize and avoid financial exploitation schemes. Most importantly, I had taken back my own story. For months, Amber had tried to write a false narrative where I was a confused, incompetent woman who couldn't be trusted to manage her own life. But that was never who I was. I was strong, I was capable, and I had survived 42 years of marriage, raised a son, built a home, and faced down people who tried to erase me. Sitting on my porch, I realized I hadn't just protected James's legacy, I had honored it. That evening, I carried a cup of tea out to the back steps and watched as the stars began to appear, one by one, against the fading sky. For the first time in years, I felt complete peace. Not the peace of having everything I wanted, but the deeper peace of knowing exactly who I was and what I was worth. James's love still lived here. In the security he left me, in the values he had taught our son, and in the life we had built brick by brick. Amber's scheme had collapsed, not only because Frank had uncovered the truth, but because the foundation James and I had created together was stronger than the lies she tried to stack on top of it. At 64, I realized something that would have seemed impossible only months earlier. I was just beginning the best chapter of my life. Not because it was free of struggle or loss, but because I was free from doubt, free from manipulation, free from the weight of someone else's narrative. I had survived betrayal and grief, but more importantly, I had rediscovered myself. And as the night air cooled and the stars multiplied above me, I understood. I wasn't broken. I was free. If my story touched you in any way, don't just scroll past, hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what you would have done in my place, and let me know where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel and how many of you share your own experiences in the comments. And of course, make sure you're subscribed. There are more stories coming, and I don't want you to miss a single one. Your support means more to me than you know.